want to get into more about this theme of being at the table. And tonight I want to look at who gets a seat. Last session, Isaiah showed us a table, a feast prepared by God, a table for all peoples, death swallowed up, tears wiped away, the nations gathered. But that raises another question. Who actually gets invited to this table? Because one of the important things I think for us to kind of consider is our tables reveal things about us. Who comes to your house and sits at your table? Who do you naturally spend time with? Who would you comfortably sit beside for 2 hours? Look around the table that you're at. That might be an answer to your question, who you might sit around for 2 hours. It's been very hard for me sitting at the table over here with Jordan. No. Who would you sit around for 2 hours? And perhaps the harder question is, who doesn't get invited to sit at your table? Our tables reveal our social worlds. Who belongs, who is valued, who is comfortable, and who is missing. In Luke 14, Jesus walks into a dinner party and starts overturning the whole thing. It really matters who you invite to dinner. So let's start in Luke 14. Luke begins, one Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. It is Sabbath. Jesus is in the house of an important Pharisee, and they're having a meal together. They're at the table together. Meals matter enormously in the book of Luke. Jesus eats with Pharisees. He eats with tax collectors. He eats with sinners. He feeds crowds. He goes to Zacchaeus' house. He breaks bread with his disciples. Again and again, the kingdom becomes visible around tables. And Luke tells us he is being carefully watched. They are watching Jesus. They are judging Jesus. They are observing Jesus' interactions and actions. But very quickly we discover that Jesus is watching them too. Before Jesus speaks about where people are sitting, Luke tells us about a sick man. There in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy, or abnormal swelling of the body. Jesus asks, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? And the table remains silent. I mean, if you can't answer that question, then it seems like a very easy question. So Jesus heals the man. And then we see that there's this interaction that happens around the table. Now, the problem here is not the Sabbath itself. Sabbath is God's gift. The problem is a form of religion here that is capable of having a suffering human standing right in front of them whilst becoming more concerned about the rule than the person. Jesus is less concerned with the rule as he is concerned with the suffering man. Jesus sees him. And I think that's why this matters as we talk about mission. Mission begins by seeing, not a demographic, not a category, not a project, but a person. It is possible to care deeply about the theology or idea of mission and still stop noticing the human being standing in front of us. Sometimes our systems, our traditions, even our ministry structures can protect us from the inconvenience of mercy. Jesus does not allow that. I was ministering at a fairly large church here in Melbourne as children's pastor, and we had Watoto come along to our church there, and everyone here probably knows Watoto. They come to church, they do the singing and dance thing, and it was great, right? I had a couple of them staying with me at my place, and I was having great interactions. Took them out to the city and to dinner and whatnot, and it was just a really great time. As I was driving them to church for their rehearsal, I said, I am going to be there. I'm going to be in the front row. I'm going to be cheering you on, and I was doing this big thing about it's going to be great. I dropped them off now. At this point in time, I had long hair. I dressed bit alternatively, and I had a beard and whatnot. But anyway, I dropped these kids off. That'll make sense. I'm not just describing what I looked like for no particular reason here. It'll make sense in a moment. I went home, got distracted, realized I'm late for church, raced up to church, and I was not sitting front and center in this very large auditorium. I was sitting up the very back right-hand corner. But as I look down, there is a man with long hair and a beard, wearing a pirate hat and a kilt, bowing down and jeering and being really loud. Of course, the people staying with me, who I said, I'll be right at the front cheering for you, what do they think? They think this man has come to church dressed up like a Scottish pirate and is making a fool of himself. I was feeling a bit indignant. I was feeling a bit upset of being misrepresented. And I was on staff. And this guy, a few people like he's making a distraction. And to our shame, we took that man and escorted him off the church property. Now, I was 20 years old. I wasn't very old. I wasn't fully formed in the frontal cortex at that point of time. We took this man who was obviously mentally ill and escorted him off the property because he was making a bit of a scene. We were more concerned with the church running uninterrupted than we were for caring for this man who was obviously mentally ill. That spoke to who was at my table. That spoke to what was important to me. I was like a Pharisee who was more concerned about the way ministry functioned than the man who was suffering in front of me. My values have changed a lot since that time. You may be able to notice. Returning to Luke, Jesus watches the guests. He notices how the guests pick the place of honor at the table. Now, this is more than choosing a good chair. This is where you sat, expressed your status. People are negotiating honor with their peers here. Who am I? Where do I belong? How important am I? And Jesus says, take the lower place. And then he gives the kingdom principle. All those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. This is what is called the great reversal. We have already heard about this in Luke. Mary saying, he has brought down rulers from their thrones, but he has lifted up the humble. The kingdom of God upturns our pursuit of status and honor. The kingdom of God is an inverted kingdom. The kingdom of God upturns the way that we order everything. But then Jesus turns from speaking to the guests and he turns to the host. And this is where it would have gotten uncomfortable. When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. Now, Jesus is not banning family dinner here, by the way. Jesus is not saying, family dinner, that's off. That's not holy anymore. He's getting to the core of a real issue. And the issue is this: if you do, they may invite you back and you will be repaid. He is talking about reciprocal honor. I invite you, you invite me. I honor you, you honor me. Relationships become transactions. And Jesus says, but when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Why? Although they cannot repay you. That's the point. Although they cannot repay you. Invite people who cannot advance you. People whose presence give you no social advantage. People who cannot return the favor. And suddenly, Jesus is describing something that looks a lot like grace. Because what did we have to offer God? How could we repay him? What leverage did we have? None. Grace welcomed us before we could ever repay. And newsflash, we can't ever repay what we've received as grace. And Jesus essentially says, let your tables tell the same story. That makes this deeply challenging, because it's possible to say we love everyone whilst arranging our lives in a way that we only ever have meaningful relationships with people who look like ourselves. Same class, culture, same stage of life, same politics, same theology, same kind of people. Yet, who is at our table tells us something about who we value. And perhaps the most important question for us is, who is missing at our tables? That was a big jump, Deacon. Long jump almost. Someone at the meal says, blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God. Now, we've seen that up on the slide. Someone says this: blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God. After Isaiah 25, we should see the parallel here immediately. That's what he's referencing. The feast and the coming kingdom, the table of God. In effect, won't it be wonderful when we're all at God's banquet? And Jesus essentially says this: let me tell you about that banquet. A man prepares a great feast. Invitations have gone out. But when everything is ready, the expected guests start making excuses. A field, oxen to tend to, a marriage. Jesus doesn't tell us that any of these things are sinful. They're ordinary, normal things. They're just the day-to-day. And perhaps that's the warning. Sometimes it's not spectacular rebellion that keeps us from noticing what God is doing in our midst. Sometimes it's our own lives have just become far too important in the mix of things. My property, my work, my family, my plans, my priorities have all become more important than obedience to the kingdom. Then the master says, go out into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. We've heard that list before. Jesus has just told the host of the dinner, invite these people. Now Jesus tells a story where the master does exactly that. Our hospitality should reflect God's hospitality. Why move towards those who cannot repay? Because God does. Why notice the overlooked? Because God does. Why cross social boundaries? Because God's kingdom does. The servant then returns and says, what you've ordered has been done. And yet the master says, there is still room. I love that line. There's still room. So the master says, go out into the roads and country lanes so that my house will be full. The invitation keeps widening. Streets, alleys, roads, further out, the forgotten and the last, because the host wants the house full. That's mission. Because there is room at God's table, we go. Not because God is reluctant, because God is generous. So we move towards people. Notice that the servant had to leave the banquet. He has to leave the celebration to go out and extend the invitation. Mission cannot remain safely at a distance. We can give, We can send and organize. But Jesus' ministry involved proximity. He touched people. He touched lepers. He entered homes. He stopped for people. He ate with people. He ate with people that would make it look terrible that he was having dinner with them. His critics called him, what? A friend of tax collectors and sinners. And that's how they would have said it, with that extra sinners, you know, the bit of the extra zing in there. Tax collectors and zingers. Yeah, singers. Yeah. Mission becomes close enough because that these categories that we designate, they become names to us. That the prisoner becomes a person. The refugee becomes a person. The addict becomes a person. The migrant becomes a person. The poor become people with stories. The unreached become our friends. That's what tables do. They bring people close. And that could be inconvenient. Real hospitality, it costs our time, our attention, our comfort. Sometimes it costs our money. Sometimes it costs our reputation. But Jesus is not asking us to merely admire God's hospitality. He is asking us to participate in it. I was heading off to a church dinner one night. And as I was reversing out of my driveway, and there were a few of us in the car, a car full of young adults, going off to a young adults dinner in church in the evening. And as I was reversing out of my driveway, I looked out and the bins were out on the street. And as I was reversing out of the driveway, I looked out and there's a lady in my bin. Now, initially I thought, going through to see if there's anything of value or whatnot. But as she was going through, I noticed that I'd had fish and chips the night before for dinner. I noticed that she opened up the fish and chip paper and was eating the food that had been left in my bin. And so I'm reversing out of the driveway. And remember again, I've got conniptions about being late to church because of the pirate man. And I'm sitting there as this lady is eating food that's been in my bin amongst my garbage. I've got to get to church. I think I was speaking actually. And I'm thinking, right here in front of me, this lady is eating garbage out of my bin, and I need to get to church. My car is full of people who are part of the ministry that I'm a part of. And by God's grace, I had the courage to stop, turn off the car, get out, and put aside what people would think of me for not turning up to church to speak, and say to that lady, come inside so I can cook you a meal. That's more important, isn't it? Jesus' ministry call to us is to inconvenience ourselves for the sake of those that don't know him or need his people to intervene. It meant that I was late. It cost me my reputation, but that looks like faithfulness in God's kingdom. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in the end what people think of you. It matters what God thinks of you. It's better to have an uncomfortable conversation that says, I'm going to be late for my speaking gig. Now, this is not giving you excuses if you're just running late because you had too long a shower or got stuck on the toilet at home. Like, don't lie and say, I was helping a lady, But in those situations that God puts someone before you, choose to do the thing that he would want. Choose the man with dropsy instead of the Sabbath. Choose to go to the highways and byways instead of going to the people of honor. It's not about making ourselves the hero. See, that's the danger in preaching this passage and telling stories like that. That one makes me look good. I made sure I kept the pirate man in because that doesn't make me look so good, right? It's not about being the hero. That's the danger in preaching it. We can start imagining ourselves as the generous hosts. We have the food, we have the answers. We will invite the needy outsiders into our world, but that misses the heart of the gospel. We are not the host, God is. And before we become servants carrying invitations, we received one ourselves. We were the people in the highways and the byways. We were the crippled and the lame and those that couldn't help themselves. We didn't earn our place. We could not repay him. Grace made room for us. Mission is not privileged Christians generously admitting unfortunate outsiders. Mission is people who received an undeserved invitation telling others that there is still room at God's table. We don't own the table, we simply serve the host. So here's another question that I think is really important. And it's not this. It's not, do you believe in mission? This church obviously does, right? You obviously do. Of course we do. The harder question is, who's missing from our tables? Who have we learned not to see? Who would we prefer not to see at God's table? Who lives nearby but never enters into our lives? Who can't repay you? Who sits outside your normal social world? Who would feel uncomfortable in your church? Who might make you uncomfortable if they came and sat at your dinner table? Who is the person that God has placed there in front of you who you need to see again with new eyes? Because Isaiah showed us a feast for all peoples. All peoples. And Jesus shows us that the servants are still going out. We're the servants. We're the ones who are still going out. And this parable finishes with the master's command to compel them to come in. Go out and compel them to come in to the streets and alleys, to the highways and byways, because there is still room. Wouldn't it be wonderful? Wouldn't it be beautiful if someone could walk into a church, this local church, and think, how on earth did all of these people end up together? Different cultures, different classes, different histories. Those society celebrates and those society ignores and those society hates. All eating together, all worshipping together, all calling one another brother and sister. And the only adequate explanation is Jesus invited us to his table. The kingdom creates tables the world doesn't know how to create. That's a picture of what heaven looks like. So we keep carrying the invitation. It really matters. It really matters who you invite to dinner. Our tables should tell the truth about God's table. And here's the core. This is the truth about God's table. There's still room. There's still room. Bless you guys.